Reading The Unknown Reality by Jane Roberts, a Seth book, Volume 2. Continuing Session 718. Alright, Seth states, Rupert has trained himself to deal with words as a writer. When he picks up a worldview that belongs to someone else, he can quite automatically translate it faithfully enough in that idiom of language. Many artists do the same thing, translating inner quote-unquote models into paint, lines, and form. So do scientists and inventors often tune into the worldviews of others, living or dead in your terms, that correlate with their own intents, talents, and purposes. These quote-unquote other reinterpreted worldviews form a matrix from which new creativity emerges. The same thing applies in more mundane endeavors in ordinary life. For example, you may be in a predicament that seems beyond solving. It may be highly individual since it is yours. It is unique and has happened in no other way before. No one else has viewed your particular dilemma through your eyes, yet others have been in similar situations, solved the challenges involved, and gone on to greater creativity and fulfillment. If you can momentarily abandon your private worldview, that focus from which you experience reality, then you can allow the experience of others who have had similar challenges to color your perception. You can tune in to their solutions and apply them to your particular circumstances. You often do this unconsciously. I do not want you to think then that such occurrences work only in esoteric terms. Many people working with the Ouija board or automatic writing receive messages that seem or purport to come from historic personages. Often, however, the material is vastly inferior to that which could have been produced by the person in question during his or her existence. Any comparison with the material received to the written books or accounts already existing would immediately show glaring discrepancies. Yet, in many such instances, the Ouija board operator or the automatic writer is, to some extent or another, tuning into a worldview, struggling to open roads of perception free enough to perceive an altered version of reality, but not equipped enough through training and temperament perhaps to express it. The most legitimate instances of communication between the living and the dead occur in an intimate personal framework, in which a dead parent makes contact with its offspring, or a husband or wife freshly out of physical reality appears to his or her mate. But very seldom do historic personages make contact, except with their own intimate circles. There is great energy, however, in those who have persevered enough to become generally known in their time, and the great impetus of that psychic and mental energy does not cease at death, but continues. In their way, others may tune into that continuing worldview, and picking it up, can be convinced that they are in contact with the physical personality who held it. You are so used to your own private interpretation of reality that when you allow yourself to stray from it, you immediately want to interpret your new experience in terms that make sense to your familiar orientation. You are also highly involved with symbols. In ordinary life, you often hamper your own creativity. When you use the Ouija board or trance procedures, you frequently free philosophical areas of your mind that have been frozen. The resulting information then definitely seems to come from outside of yourself, and because you are literal-minded, you try to interpret such experiences in a literal way. The material must come from a philosopher, therefore, with amusement, says. And since it certainly seems profound to your usual mundane organization, then it appears that such information must originate with a profound mind, certainly not your own. You may signify this to yourself symbolically so that the board or the automatic writing designates its origin as being Socrates or Plato. If you are spiritualistically oriented, the information may come from a famous psychic recently dead. Instead, you yourself have momentarily escaped from your accustomed worldview or home program. You are reaching out into other levels of reality, but still interpreting your experience in old terms. Therefore, much of its creativity escapes you. You are each as valid as Socrates or Plato. Your influences reach through the entire framework of actuality in ways that you do not understand. Socrates and Plato and William James specialized in certain fashions. You know these individuals as names of people that existed, but in your terms, and in your terms only, those existences represented the flowering aspects of their personalities. They often dwelled nameless upon the face of the earth, as many of you do, in your terms only now, before reaching what you think of as those summits. So right here it says end of dictation, but he's actually going to go into the information that Rupert experienced as a fly. So right here in the notes, it says that Seth returned. He delivered a half a page of material for Jane and Rob, including this passage. He said, quote, he, or Rupert, he has made an extraordinary leap into his psychic library, and it is freeing him physically. You have made as vital a leap, and it is freeing you artistically. The library is valid, and in the most legitimate of terms, it is far more important, for example, than a physical library. End quote by Seth. Right here, Rob's looking through his notebook after the session, and he's noticing from the 697th session, May 13th, 1974, from Volume 1, that in that session, Seth had said, quote, because you are now a conscious species in your terms, there are racial idealizations that you can accept or deny. End quote. Rob says he's never forgotten that statement, and Seth had mentioned that in the 699th session he'd go into the his question, when the material will fit, in quotes. And so Rob is stating, what would a state other than a conscious one be? He has difficulty conceiving of such a situation. And Seth is going to explain here. So Rob's adding, but how could the species or its individual members not be conscious? And this is a good example of how information can be distorted, not completely understood, but luckily they were able to, or Rob was able to get this question out. For anyone else who's read Volume 1 and seen that statement and been like, what? First, Rob notes that when Jane first read his question after she'd held the 697th session, she told me that she, quote, didn't get it, end quote. basically telling him that perhaps he was drawing inference from Seth's material that wasn't intended. So Rob had read the question out loud, and Seth came through with his answer. So Seth states, he says, "Now, I have been using your terms as I understood your meaning of them. There are, in those terms, gradations. When I use the word quote-unquote conscious or quote-unquote consciousness, I meant it as I thought you understood it. I thought that you meant conscious of being conscious, or placing yourself on the one hand outside of a portion of your own consciousness, viewing it and then saying, quote, I am conscious of my consciousness, end quote. Consciousness is always conscious of itself and of its validity and integrity, and in those terms there is no unconsciousness. When I use the term time-wise, I refer it to the formation of a structure from which one kind of consciousness then views itself, sees itself as unique, and then tries to form other kinds of consciousness structures. A fly is conscious of itself, fulfilled within that reality, and feels no need to form an extension in quotes, an extension of that awareness from which to view its own existence. In your terms, time considerations involved extensions of that kind of consciousness, in which separations could occur and divisions could be made. In terms of an organic structure, this would be likened to developing another arm or leg, or protrusion or filament, another method of locomotion through another kind of dimension. The fly is intensely conscious, at every moment engrossed in itself and its environment, precisely tuned to elements of which you are quote-unquote unconscious. There are simply different kinds of consciousness, and you cannot basically compare one to the other, any more than you can compare, say, a toad to a star, to an apple to a thought, to a woman to a child, to a native to a suburbanite, to a spider to a cat. They are varieties of consciousness, each focused upon its own view of reality, each containing experience that others exclude. So that's the end of dictation, and right here Rob is noting basically that the 718th session was to become the birthing of the worldview of Paul Cézanne, a psychic interpretation, the book that Jane did, and also the After Death Journal of an American Philosopher, the worldview of William James. So they didn't anticipate it, but that did happen. And she never did any additional information or material from Carl Jung. Rob notes that the entire worldview concept is extremely interesting, of course, and worthy of continuous investigation. And he also says, oddly enough, the original pages of the James material that Jane saw mentally during the 717th session, and later presented in Chapter 6 of Psychic Politics, never appeared in After Death Journal. There were two different James books in her quote-unquote library, Jane had said. She transcribed only one of them. All right, now, session notes. Session note number 2 states, a note added several months later, I see now that I should enlarge upon note 2 for the 715th session, in which I wrote that Jane, quote, would initiate the transposition of material from Volume 2 of Unknown Reality into Politics, since she was so intimately and enthusiastically involved in producing both books at the same time, end quote. For her to work this way is entirely in keeping with her spontaneous nature. She intuitively seeks to use whatever sources of information, including Seth himself, she has at hand for whatever project she may be engaged in. In the early chapters of Politics especially, then, she both quotes and paraphrases material from Volume 2, beginning with the 714th session, which contains her account of her original inspiration for that work. However, Jane's use of material in this manner is quite natural in another way also, for Politics represents her personal exploration of the unknown reality that Seth has been so graphically describing in his own work. So before I continue on this, hopefully you guys have read her book, Psychic Politics, and her other ones as well. But if not, this is going to kind of help you understand what was going on a little. Anyways, Rob goes on, he says, for example, Jane began Politics by describing how impatient she was, how quote-unquote disconnected she felt because she hadn't been inspired since finishing her adventures 2 months previously. Indeed, she was very upset over this and quite serious in her feeling, and she later wrote in her new book of being abandoned by her inner self. In Volume 2, now, the reader can note the many events Jane was actually involved in before she began Politics, and see just how objective her perception of her activities was, or see really the demanding standards of creativity against which she constantly judges herself. Okay, you guys can read the rest of that from here down if you'd like. And you can see note 3, what that's referring to. I wrote it down. And then note 4. So note 4 says, the contents of this note flow out of what I wrote in note 2. Seth mentions Jane's fly experience in this 718th session, though really very briefly, and Jane discussed it in more detail in Chapter 5 of her book, Politics. Then in Chapter 6 of her book, she presented long excerpts from the James Young material as it developed in the 717th session. So if you want more of that as well, you could have that book and read that. Who knows, one of these days maybe I'll read it, but it is interesting. And note 5 is saying again, to see Jane's library material, you'd go to Chapter 7 of her book, Psychic Politics. And number 6 states that since William James died in 1910, this means that in our terms, Jane picked up on his worldview as it existed some 54 years after his physical death. We could easily ask Seth a dozen questions about the ideas he's given in just this one paragraph of material. Very lengthy answers could result, leading to more queries. A book on worldviews could even develop, but the questions always pile up ahead of us. Often they're never voiced, no matter how interesting they may be. And note number 8 states, Rob states, Seth's information here that scientists and inventors often tune into the worldviews of other such individuals at once reminded me that a similar long-term situation could have existed within the Butts family, so his family. And in Volume 1, you can see the 680th session with notes 1 to 3. You're not going to see notes 1 to 3, but he states, my father, Robert Sr., who died in 1971, was very gifted mechanically. According to Seth, a still living probable self of Robert Butts Sr. is, quote, a well-known inventor who never married but used his mechanically creative abilities to the fullest while avoiding emotional commitment, end quote by Seth. Rob goes on, although my father's, quote, sole intent, end quote, was the very challenging one of raising a family in this reality. Still, he may have often exchanged ideas about automobiles, motorcycles, welding torches, cameras, and so forth with that other inventor self. If none of this is making sense to you right here, then you definitely need to go and see the 680th session, where Seth talks about Rob and Rob's family. Anyways, Rob questions right here. Do probable selves actually communicate with each other through their worldview frameworks then? Or can such an interchange of idea or emotion take place more quote-unquote directly at times, simply between the probable personalities involved? Either situation can apply, it seems to me, or the two methods may merge at any given quote-unquote time. We plan to ask Seth to elaborate. So, number 9 states, 9 months ago, February 1974, Seth mentioned the few tentative contacts I'd evidently made with my deceased mother through dreams. You can see the 683rd session after 11:30, then see my account of one such dream in note 5 for that session. I'm going to see if I can find that for you if it's interesting enough for you guys. 2 months later, in the 693rd session, Seth described how I reacted on a cellular or quote-unquote unconscious level to communications from my mother as Jane and I considered buying a certain house in my childhood neighborhood in Sayre, Pennsylvania. So far, Jane has nothing to report about meetings of any kind with her late mother or father. All of our parents died between February 1971 and November 1973. Okay, note number 10. Rob states, I'd like to dwell a bit upon a point I made in the opening notes for this session, when I wrote about mediums or others contacting the well-known dead. I mean it kindly, but Jane and I have never believed that a living individual could be in contact with a famous dead person, especially through the Ouija board or automatic writing. Although we haven't scoffed at such instances when we heard of them, we've certainly regarded those encounters through very skeptical eyes. As anyone would, right? The gist of our attitudes is that we find it most difficult to believe that quote-unquote Socrates, wherever he is and whatever he may be doing in our terms, is willing to drop everything to give very garbled information to a well-intentioned, really innocent person living in, say, a small town in Virginia. There must be other things he wants to do. Seth's worldview concept and Jane's own experiences with it make the accounts of such happenings much more understandable. It kind of seems like there is somebody, I haven't researched this, but somebody that was saying that they were contacting Socrates here, but I'm not 100% on that. So, anyways, that's the end of the whole session here. Okay, real quick, anyone who is interested in reading those notes about Rob and his dreams and Seth going into his parents from volume 1, here it is. These are his notes. You can just pause and read. Pause right now. And then there's the rest of it. Pause and read. And there's the last of it. Pause and read. All right. Thank you for watching, you guys. I hope everybody has an awesome day.